Wind ripped across the firing range, snapping paper targets in their frames. The quiet woman stepped to the line. $20, says she, misses so wide the bullet ends up in town. Laughter erupted, brutal and certain. 5 rounds, 50 meters, easy for any real shooter. She fired once, twice, 3 times, not a single hit on the paper. By the 5th shot, the mocking was deafening. Then the range officer stepped forward, eyes locked beyond the target. His voice was cold steel. Check the back wall. The silence that followed would change everything. This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new. 2 if you've been with us. 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The air on the firing range was thick with the scent of spent gunpowder and the oppressive weight of a high noon sun. It baked the gravel underfoot and turned the metal on the firing line into a series of hot, unforgiving surfaces. A breeze, thin and deceptive, occasionally whipped across the open ground, tugging at the loose fabric of the standard issue fatigues and stirring up fine clouds of dust. It was a world of harsh lines and stark contrasts, where the only colors were the drab olive of military green, the deep gray of the concrete berms, and the distant glaring white of paper targets standing sentinel 100 meters away. Dana Voss stood at her station, a rifle cradled in her arms. Her uniform hung on her frame in a way that suggested it was a size too large, obscuring the contours of her body. Her dark hair was pulled back into a utilitarian ponytail, devoid of any style, a practical arrangement that revealed a face that was, to most, a study in neutrality. Her expression was a blank slate, a careful absence of emotion that had become her most effective camouflage. She was a ghost in the daylight, a figure so unassuming that she had perfected the art of being invisible. To the casual observer, she was just another logistics recruit, a placeholder in a world built for warriors. The mockery began before she had even properly settled into her stance. It was a low, confident buzz that had been building since the moment the logistics personnel were ordered to the firing line. Private Mason Cole, a combat trainee with a swagger that seemed to defy the laws of physics, was the first to give voice to the collective derision. $20, says she, misses so wide the bullet ends up in the parking lot, he announced, loud enough for a dozen people to hear and an equal number to chuckle. His grin was a masterpiece of casual cruelty, his posture radiating the easy confidence of someone who had never known a moment of doubt. A corporal named Trent Evers, a stocky figure with a tight, muscular frame, took the bet without a second thought. "I'll take that bet, Cole, but I'm betting she doesn't even know which end the bullet comes out of." The laughter that followed was a wave, crashing over the firing range and leaving behind a bitter residue of condescension. Sergeant Raul Mendoza, the drill instructor in charge of the exercise, stood with his hands behind his back, a faint smirk playing on his lips. His posture was ramrod straight, a perfect embodiment of the discipline and authority he commanded. He was a man who lived and breathed hierarchy, and to him this entire scenario was a meticulously orchestrated theatrical performance. He saw himself as the director, and Dana's inevitable failure was the final triumphant scene. "All right, listen up," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a serrated blade. "Some of you think that support personnel don't need to know the fundamentals of marksmanship. Some of you think that a rifle is just a dangerous tool for those in the thick of it. Today, we're going to put that dangerous thinking to the test. We're going to see what happens when the people who keep the gears turning are asked to step up and perform." Mendoza's gaze swept over the logistics personnel with an undisguised air of disdain, lingering on Dana for a moment longer than necessary. His eyes seemed to say, "This is your purpose," to be a lesson in inadequacy for the rest of them. The combat trainees, who had already completed their qualifications with textbook precision and consistent groupings, were clustered together in the shade of a small overhang. Their relaxed postures and casual chatter spoke volumes about their confidence, a stark contrast to the nervous tension radiating from the logistics section. To them, this was not a challenge, but an exhibition, a public reinforcement of their superior status. They were the wolves, and the logistics team were the sheep, and today they were being given a rifle and told to act like wolves. Watching it all unfold from a few meters back was Range Safety Officer Arthur Graves. Unlike Mendoza's overt display of authority, Graves was a study in profound stillness. His weathered face was largely hidden behind the dark lenses of his safety glasses, which were the only part of his attire that seemed to betray any kind of emotion, reflecting the intense sunlight back in an inscrutable obsidian glare. Graves was an older man, a veteran whose quiet demeanor and economical movements spoke of a long career spent in the shadows of conflict. He never raised his voice, never wasted a gesture. While the others saw a simple exercise in humiliation, Graves watched with the patient intensity of a predator, his eyes moving across the firing line, analyzing every minute detail, every slight twitch, every breath. There was a subtle tension in his jaw, a slight furrow in his brow that the others were too caught up in their own drama to notice. His stillness was not indifference, it was a kind of high alert, a deep-seated suspicion that something was not quite what it seemed. As Dana stepped up to the firing line, the rifle felt cool against her gloved hands, a familiar weight and balance that felt as natural as breathing. Her fingers found their place on the foregrip with an almost unconscious precision, a series of micro-adjustments that would have gone unnoticed by anyone without an encyclopedic knowledge of firearms handling. She performed the safety checks with a deliberate, mechanical cadence, her motions appearing functional and rudimentary to the untrained eye. She appeared to be going through the motions, a person following instructions she barely understood. The other trainees, watching through binoculars and spotting scopes, snickered at her seemingly clumsy posture. It wasn't a confident stance, they observed. It wasn't a professional one. It was just adequate. The wind picked up, a sudden gust that rattled the paper targets and swirled the dust at their feet. It was a perfect excuse for a miss, a natural element to blame for an inevitable failure. But Dana didn't seem to notice. Her focus was on the target, a patch of white canvas in the distance, a void waiting to be filled. The world seemed to narrow down to the front sight post and the blurry outline of the target in the scope. She took a deep breath, a controlled inhale and exhale that was barely perceptible. It wasn't the practiced breathing of a marksman, but rather the quiet, methodical rhythm of a person whose mind was a fortress of calm. The moment stretched, a fragile filament of time pulled taut before snapping. The laughter died down to a low murmur. All eyes were on her. The stakes, though entirely self-created, felt impossibly high to everyone watching. To the combat trainees, it was a test of their superiority. To Mendoza, it was a display of his authority. To Graves, it was an enigma, a puzzle he was determined to solve. To Dana, it was simply another task, another box to check, another moment to maintain the carefully constructed facade she had spent years building. She had spent 7 years choosing to be invisible, to be a ghost in the machine, and she had mastered it with a frightening efficiency. But now, with a single pull of a trigger, that delicate invisibility was about to be put to its greatest test. The air was electric with anticipation, the silence punctuated only by the wind and the distant clatter of a few spent shell casings being swept into a collection bin. Dana's finger rested on the trigger, a feather-light touch that seemed to hover between action and inaction. Her head was tilted slightly, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. She wasn't just aiming, she was measuring the distance, the wind, the subtle shift in pressure, the very molecules of the air itself. The world was a complex, multi-layered puzzle, and she was simply waiting for the right moment to place the final piece. The moment arrived, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the environment, and her finger tightened. The metallic click of the safety being disengaged, the soft rasp of her rifle being shouldered, the almost soundless tension of her breathing, it all led to this single moment. The first shot. Everyone leaned in, eager to see her fail, eager to witness the public humiliation they had been so carefully building. It was a moment of shared expectation, a singular thought that rippled through the gathered crowd, a miss, a wild shot, a confirmation of their prejudice. The first round was chambered, a small yet profound act, and the stage was set for the impossible. The first shot rang out, a sharp, concussive crack that momentarily drowned out the low, derisive murmur. A small plume of dust puffed up from the dirt in front of Dana's firing position, a ghost-like exhalation that vanished as quickly as it appeared. All eyes, focused through the magnification of binoculars and the naked eye alike, darted towards the flimsy paper sheet at the end of the range. Nothing, not a tear, not a splinter, not the slightest indication that it had been struck by a projectile. The silence lasted for 3 heartbeats, a pregnant pause of collective disbelief, before the laughter erupted once more, a chaotic, uninhibited roar that shattered the fragile calm. Did she even open her eyes? A voice from the combat trainees jeered, the sound swallowed by a fresh wave of chortles and snorts. The paper target, an innocent two-dimensional square, hung there in silent defiance, a visual testament to what appeared to be an epic, embarrassing failure. Sergeant Mendoza's smirk widened, his chest puffing out with a sense of righteous vindication. He gestured dismissively towards the firing line, his contempt a tangible, physical force. "See that?" he yelled over the din. "That's what happens when you rely on people who haven't handled a weapon in anger. That's the difference between a fighter and that." He let the insult hang in the air, a cruel punchline to a joke only he and the combat trainees found amusing. Dana, for her part, remained a statue. Her face was a perfect, unreadable mask, her movements as fluid and mechanical as a well-oiled machine. She took a moment, another deliberate, quiet intake of breath before firing the second round. Another report, another billow of dust, and the pristine target remained unblemished. The second volley of laughter was louder, more confident, a joyous confirmation of their initial prejudices. The combat trainees were now fully committed to the spectacle, their earlier professionalism dissolving into a schoolyard-like taunting. They made exaggerated gestures, pantomiming a wild, flailing aim, and their voices carried on the wind, filled with a newfound creativity in their mockery. "Maybe she's aiming at the wrong range," a young private shouted, his voice cracking with glee. "I've seen stormtroopers with better accuracy," added another, the joke a tired but effective standby in military humor. The third, fourth, and fifth shots followed in rapid succession, each one met with a crescendo of derision. With every consecutive miss, the confidence of the combat trainees swelled, their relaxed postures giving way to an almost smug certainty. The sound of the gunfire was quickly overpowered by the human noise, a cacophony of sneering chuckles and theatrical disappointment. The smell of hot metal and spent powder clung to the air, an acrid perfume of their collective victory. To them, the exercise was a resounding success, a lesson learned, and a hierarchy reinforced. The quiet woman from logistics was a footnote, a living illustration of their inherent superiority. With her final round fired, Dana lowered the weapon and stepped back from the firing line, her expression unchanged. There was no hint of frustration, no flush of embarrassment on her cheeks. She was a blank canvas in a room full of brightly painted emotions. This unwavering neutrality, this complete lack of a reaction, only seemed to fuel the fires of mockery. Her silence to them was not strength, but a final, pathetic admission of her inadequacy. She was just another non-combatant, a cog in the massive, lumbering bureaucracy of military logistics, and her role in this story was over, or so they thought. Standing a short distance away, Range Safety Officer Arthur Graves had not moved from his post. He hadn't joined in the laughter, and his silence was of a different quality. Not the quiet of a blank slate, but the deep, thoughtful stillness of a man who had seen too much to jump to conclusions. He was a veteran of a different kind, one who understood that the loudest noise often concealed the most important truth. While the others were focused on the untouched target, his gaze had been drawn to something else entirely, a small detail that had set off a silent alarm in his mind. He began to walk, his worn combat boots crunching on the loose gravel with a methodical rhythm that cut a clear path through the chaotic energy of the laughing trainees. He moved past the firing line, past the congratulatory back-patting and the triumphant smirks, and headed directly towards the distant targets. He didn't even glance at the pristine sheet of paper. He continued walking, his focus unyielding, past the flimsy wooden frame that held the targets in place, all the way to the unyielding concrete backstop that served as the final absolute barrier for any errant rounds. The laughter began to die down, a gradual but definite fading as people's attention was drawn to the figure of Graves, his posture now a study in bone-deep focus. They were confused by his movements. What was he doing? The show was over. The lesson had been taught. Graves stopped at the wall, a massive, imposing grey structure that had absorbed the punishment of countless rounds over the years. His head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing behind the tinted lenses. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the cold, rough surface, and then he froze. His stillness was absolute, a sudden, complete cessation of all movement. The subtle furrow in his brow deepened, and his weathered face, a map of 1,000 forgotten battles, went pale. He had seen things in his life, things that defied common sense, that challenged the laws of probability and physics. But what he saw now was a ghost, a perfect, undeniable impossibility. There, embedded in the concrete at the precise height of a human torso, were 5 bullet holes. They were not scattered randomly across the surface. They were not clustered loosely. They were a single, impossible point of impact. 5 holes, so perfectly aligned and impossibly close together that they could have been obscured by a single American quarter. Graves slowly, deliberately traced the trajectory backward with his eyes. From the unyielding concrete, through the exact center of where a human body would have stood behind the paper target, and finally, through the microscopic gap between the paper and its wooden frame, a gap no wider than a coin's edge. The bullets had threaded a needle, an act of precision so profound that it belonged in the realm of myth. He turned back toward the assembled group, his eyes locking onto Dana, who still stood at her firing station, posture unshaken, her features carved into an unyielding mask of calm. Not a flicker of triumph, no trace of anger, just the same impassive stillness she had held from the very first moment. His boots crunched against the gravel as he began moving toward the cluster of onlookers. Each step seemed deliberate, heavy, as if he were wading through deep water, carrying with him the weight of what he had just seen. His gaze swept past the wide-eyed trainees until it found Sergeant Mendoza, who stood near the center, still wearing the smug expression of a man convinced he had proven his point. The veteran closed the remaining distance with the slow inevitability of a storm front. When he finally stopped beside Mendoza, he leaned in close enough that his words wouldn't have to rise above a whisper. The sound that emerged was almost too soft to hear, stripped bare of tone or inflection, but edged with a steel that left no room for misunderstanding. "Sergeant," he said, each syllable deliberate, precise. "Check the back wall." The effect was immediate, a chain reaction that swept through the firing line like an unseen detonation. In an instant, every thread of mocking chatter, every echo of cruel laughter, collapsed into a suffocating silence. One moment, the air had been alive with condescension and self-satisfied jeers. The next, it held only the low hiss of the wind moving through the range and the pounding of suddenly rapid heartbeats. Heads turned in unison. First toward Mendoza, whose confident smirk had drained into a sickly ash-grey pallor. His eyes, now wide and searching, betrayed the dawning realization that something was very, very wrong. Then, inevitably, every gaze shifted to the backstop, the unassuming stretch of grey concrete that now stood as the silent, immovable witness to what had just occurred. In that frozen moment, the firing range ceased to be a place of swagger and noise. It became something else entirely, an open-air cathedral where disbelief hung in the air like incense, and the impossible was no longer a matter of theory but fact. The hushed silence that had fallen over the firing range was absolute, a profound and terrible quiet that was almost more deafening than the laughter that had preceded it. It was the silence of a world turned on its axis, of a reality that had just been shattered by an impossible truth. The grins on the faces of the combat trainees, so confident and cruel just moments before, had not so much faded as they had been violently wiped clean. They were replaced by expressions of wide-eyed disbelief, of utter confusion that slowly, agonizingly, began to curdle into something that resembled fear. Sergeant Mendoza, his face now a sickly shade of white, was trapped in a silent, desperate visual dialogue. His eyes darted from the 5 impossible bullet holes on the concrete backstop to Dana Voss, who stood impassively at her firing position. He was searching for an explanation, a trick of the light, a mechanical malfunction, anything that could restore the order he had so meticulously built his worldview upon. But the bullet holes were a cold, hard fact, and Dana's expressionless face offered nothing but an impenetrable void. The hierarchy he had championed, the very foundation of his authority, was crumbling before his eyes, a sandcastle being washed away by an unforgiving tide of reality. The triumphant swagger that had defined him was gone, replaced by a brittle, frantic energy that he was struggling to contain. It was Arthur Graves who finally broke the quiet, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to emanate not from his throat, but from a deep well of grim experience. He didn't shout or make a grand pronouncement. He spoke to them with the calm, measured authority of a man who had seen too many impossible things become real. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his eyes sweeping across the frozen faces of the trainees, "what you've just witnessed is an event that, according to everything we know about ballistics, human physiology, and basic mathematics, should not exist." Graves walked towards the group, his movements slow and deliberate, each step weighted with the significance of his words. He was not just an instructor, he was a narrator of a new, terrifying reality. 5 rounds fired through a gap no wider than 2 millimeters. 5 rounds that all struck the same precise point on a solid concrete backstop 100 meters away. The margin of error alone for a shot like that, the variables of wind drift, the natural human tremor, the minute imperfections in the ammunition itself, they all make this a statistical impossibility. The level of precision required for a feat like this is, to be blunt, theoretically achievable by maybe a handful of people on the planet. Maybe. The trainees listened in a state of suspended animation, their minds reeling as Graves laid out the chilling facts. His words were a series of hammer blows, shattering their preconceived notions one by one. Their laughter now seemed like a distant foreign memory, a foolish sound made by people who were, in a very real sense, blind. Corporal Trent Evers, the same man who had confidently bet that Dana didn't know which end of the rifle the bullets came from, was staring at the backstop through his binoculars, his hands trembling so violently that the image in his scope was a blur of grey and light. He lowered the binoculars, his face a mask of awe and terror. His voice, when it came, was a barely audible, strangled gasp. That's not human!" The whispered words hung in the air, a final, horrifying punctuation mark on Graves's cold, scientific explanation. It was a truth they were all thinking, a silent scream of disbelief. The woman they had dismissed as a support staffer, a mere cog in the machine, had just demonstrated a level of mastery that felt more like a force of nature than a human skill. Sergeant Mendoza, his face flushed with a desperate, impotent rage, rounded on Evers. "Shut up, Evers! That's enough!" His command, so absolute and powerful just minutes before, now carried none of its usual weight. It was the sound of a man trying to plug a gaping leak with his bare hands. He was losing control, and everyone knew it. Before the tension could escalate further, a new presence entered the firing range, a man whose arrival was as sudden and decisive as a thunderclap. Staff Sergeant Victor Hale. He was a figure of quiet, unshakable authority that seemed to operate on a different frequency entirely. His uniform, though regulation, held a different kind of precision. Not the starched, theatrical crispness of a drill instructor, but the worn, practical fit of a man who had seen real action. He didn't belong to the training command. He didn't wear the standard insignia of a local unit. He simply existed, and his presence was a command unto itself. Victor walked with a purpose that seemed to cut through the heavy air of shock and confusion. He didn't make a sound, but his arrival was a seismic event. The trainees, still frozen in place, instinctively snapped to attention, their eyes now darting to this new, mysterious figure. He took one look at the 5 bullet holes, a quick practice glance that seemed to register the entire impossible situation in a fraction of a second. Then his gaze shifted to Dana, who remained in the same serene posture at the firing line. His entire demeanor changed, the quiet authority in his eyes hardening into a focused, predatory intensity. Without a word of explanation, without acknowledging anyone else, he issued his first and only command. "Clear the range," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight that transcended rank and station. Now, Mendoza, caught between his crumbling authority and the presence of this new, intimidating figure, tried to assert himself one last time. "Staff Sergeant, this is my training exercise. I need to understand what just happened here." His voice was thin and reedy, a pale imitation of the bellow he had used minutes before. Victor turned his gaze on Mendoza, and the drill instructor flinched visibly. It was a look that seemed to strip Mendoza of all his rank, all his bravado, and leave him exposed and vulnerable. "What just happened here?" Victor replied, his voice a low, chilling whisper that was somehow louder than any shout. "Is way above your pay grade, drill instructor. Clear the range. The command was final." It was a termination of the conversation, an end to the public spectacle. It took a full 15 minutes to move everyone out. 15 minutes of confused muttering, nervous sidelong glances at Dana, and frantic, whispered theories that ranged from mechanical malfunction to divine intervention. The combat trainees who had been laughing just moments earlier now looked like they had witnessed a ghost. A terrifying event that had not only challenged their understanding of skill and marksmanship, but their very understanding of reality itself. They shuffled out in a haze of confusion, their confidence shattered and their smug smirks replaced by an expression of profound existential dread. When the last trainee had left, the only people remaining on the firing range were Dana Voss, Staff Sergeant Victor Hale, and the silent, weathered veteran Arthur Graves, who had watched it all unfold with a grim, knowing look. The stage was set, and the true conversation was about to begin. The echoes of the range clearing had faded, leaving behind a profound and heavy silence that was a universe away from the shocked quiet of minutes before. The setting sun, now lower in the sky, cast long, distorted shadows across the gravel, painting the firing range in shades of burnt orange and deep maroon. Arthur Graves, a silent sentinel, had retreated to the shadows of the equipment shed, a respectful distance away. He was a veteran who understood that some conversations were not meant for a crowd, and that the tension now crackling between the two figures on the firing line was of a far more ancient and dangerous kind than anything the training center had ever seen. Dana Voss stood with her back to the pristine targets and the impossible backstop, her posture still that of an unassuming logistics recruit, but there was a subtle shift in her energy, a barely perceptible loosening of the rigid, emotionless mask she had worn for years. Staff Sergeant Victor Hale approached her, his steps no longer cutting through the tension, but instead sinking into it, each one weighted with 7 years of unanswered questions. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving from the bullet-scarred wall to her face, a face he had believed was buried in a classified grave. "Hello, Marcus," she said, and the sound of her voice was a physical jolt. It wasn't the flat, uninspired tone of the logistics trainee. It was a voice that carried an edge, a resonance forged in the fire of shared history and bitter experience. It was the voice of a partner, a ghost, a legend. It was the voice that had once whispered intel into his ear while they lay hidden in the dust of a 1,000-year-old desert. Victor, for the first time since his arrival, faltered. His eyes widened just slightly as his civilian name, a name he had not heard spoken aloud in years, hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. "Dana!" he began, his voice a low, strangled rasp. "We thought you were—" She cut him off, a small, humorless smirk playing at the corner of her lips, a stark and unsettling contrast to the blank expression she had maintained throughout the day. "Dead?" The report said the entire team was eliminated, no survivors, no recoverable intelligence, no trace of Phantom Trace. The name, when he spoke it, was a mixture of awe and profound, aching loss. It was a code name that was more than a code name. It was a ghost story, a myth whispered in hushed tones in classified briefings and dimly lit command centers. It was a name that belonged to a legend, a sniper who could thread needles with bullets at impossible distances, a legend who was officially and definitively dead. For 7 years he had lived with her ghost. He had read the final report 1,000 times, each word a fresh wound. The mission in the Marash Valley, the double cross, the comms blackout, the silent, terrifying assumption that they were all gone. He had carried the weight of that day, the weight of the political chess game that had sacrificed a team of the world's most elite operators for a fleeting tactical advantage. He had lived with the guilt of command, of not seeing the betrayal until it was too late. He had searched for her, a hopeless, classified hunt for a woman who was supposed to be a body in a shallow, unmarked grave. He had chased whispers and rumors, pursued false leads from Istanbul to Damascus, always finding nothing but more evidence that the legend was, in fact, just that, a legend that had met a definitive end. Now here she was, not in a classified tomb, not in a shadowy safe house, but here, on a mundane military firing range, cleaning rifles and wearing a uniform that was 2 sizes too big. 7 years, Dana, he said, his voice a low, raw thing, a distillation of frustration and relief. 7 years we've been looking. The hell you weren't hiding. Dana's smile, if it could even be called that, deepened slightly. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was a smile of cold, hard defiance. Her left hand, a hand that had just hours ago seemed to be an instrument of incompetence, began to move. Slowly, with a deliberate and profound purpose, she rolled up the sleeve of her uniform. The rough, heavy fabric bunched at her elbow, revealing the smooth, unblemished skin of her forearm. The setting sun caught the skin at a specific angle, and then it caught the ink. It was a cinematic moment, a flash of revelation that seemed to slow time itself. The light hit a patch of dark, intricate ink, illuminating a tattoo that had been carefully, meticulously hidden for years. It was a phantom wraith, a spectral figure with wispy, ethereal tendrils that curled gracefully around the length of a rifle barrel. It was a masterpiece of military ink, a permanent, beautiful piece of lethal art. But it was not the image itself that made Victor's breath catch in his throat. It was the detail, the tiny, meticulously rendered markings on the tendrils of the wraith. Etched into the ink, so small they were almost invisible, were a series of precise cryptic GPS coordinates. Victor's hand, the one he had been holding in a fist by his side, trembled. It was a small, involuntary tremor, a flicker of emotion he had believed himself incapable of. He recognized the coordinates. The moment he saw them, he felt the knowledge like a physical gut punch, a sudden, brutal shock that knocked the air from his lungs. They were not just random numbers, they were the coordinates of a classified facility, a black site so secret it had no official designation, a place that existed only in the memories of a few men and women who were now all either dead, missing, or sitting here on a military training range in plain sight. They were the coordinates of the place where Phantom Trace had been born, where she had been trained to become something more than a soldier, something more than human. The realization struck him with the crushing weight of a tidal surge, leaving no room for denial. She hadn't simply vanished into the shadows. She had deliberately walked back into the place where her story had first taken shape. She had concealed herself in plain sight, woven seamlessly into the machinery of everyday life, a living legend reduced to the most unremarkable role imaginable. It was not an accident, nor an act of resignation. It was a calculated return to the origins of her identity, a final, unyielding act of defiance against the very system that had once shaped her and then turned on her. "The Marash Valley Op," he murmured, the name itself feeling like a weight pressing against his chest, each syllable steeped in 7 long years of guilt, unanswered questions, and lies accepted as truth. "They told us it was a failure, bad intel. We always suspected it was a setup." Dana held his gaze without flinching, her expression carved from equal parts steel and long-buried vindication. "It was a setup, Marcus. And it had nothing to do with tactics or operational necessity. It was about erasing an inconvenient liability. It was about protecting a certain senator's son, a man who could not be allowed to be compromised. So they cleaned house, they sacrificed a team, they buried a mission, and they sacrificed us without a second thought." Her tone had shifted, the measured restraint giving way to a voice like sharpened steel, each word released with the cold precision of a marksman's shot. "That was the day I understood the difference, Marcus, the difference between serving your country and serving the people who sit above you pulling the strings. I will not be their weapon. I will not kill for the wrong cause. If that means disappearing, so be it." Her words cut through the air like shrapnel, raw and unsoftened, revealing the naked truth behind her absence. She had not died in battle. She had been betrayed by the very institution she had bled for. And in response, she had betrayed it in turn, not with malice, but with the calculated precision of a professional who refused to be used. She chose erasure over obedience, invisibility over complicity, vanishing into anonymity rather than allowing herself to be nothing more than a disposable piece in a game played by men who thought soldiers were assets to be moved, sacrificed and forgotten. She slowly began to roll her sleeve back down, the motion deliberate and final. The phantom wraith and its coordinates disappeared from the light, vanishing back into the shadows of her carefully constructed life. The simple act of covering the tattoo felt like a closing door, a definitive end to their conversation. "So you disappeared," Victor said, the raw frustration returning to his voice. "I became someone else," she replied, her voice now returning to that quiet, neutral tone of the logistics recruit. "Someone who could clean rifles and manage inventory and never have to take another shot that I wasn't absolutely certain was for the right reasons, and now I'm exactly where I choose to be." She looked at the impossible grouping on the concrete wall, her gaze distant but knowing. "Tell them," she said, her voice dropping to a low, powerful whisper that was somehow louder than any shout. "Tell them I'm exactly where I choose to be, and if they have a problem with that, they can come discuss it with me personally." The message was a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge to the very people who had declared her dead, and now, in their frantic search for her, had accidentally uncovered her. She had been found, but she had not been captured. She had simply revealed herself on her own terms, in a way that asserted her power and her freedom. Victor, a man who had dedicated his life to a mission he believed in, now stood before a walking, talking contradiction of that mission, a phantom from his past who was not a ghost but a defiant, living, breathing legend. The stage was set, and the game, a game he had just been unknowingly pulled into, had only just begun. The last light of the sun was a thin, fading line of bruised purple and deep orange on the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the firing range. The heavy tension that had filled the space had not dissipated, but it had changed. The confrontational edge of the earlier exchange had been replaced by a somber, reflective atmosphere. Staff Sergeant Victor Hale stood alone with Dana Voss. The impossible truth of her presence and the chilling precision of her shots, now a heavy, undeniable weight in the silence between them. He was no longer looking at her as a myth or a ghost, but as a living, breathing testament to a mission that had gone horrifically wrong, and he was filled with a desperate need for the full story. Dana turned her gaze from the impossible bullet holes on the backstop and met his eyes. Her expression was no longer the blank slate of the logistics recruit, but neither was it the cold, defiant mask of Phantom Trace. It was something in between, the weary, knowing gaze of a woman who had seen the worst of humanity and had chosen to walk away from it all. She saw the questions in his eyes, the guilt, the confusion, and the genuine need for an explanation. She knew he deserved the truth, not as a superior officer, but as the partner she had once trusted with her life. "The Marash Valley," she began, the name itself carrying the weight of a trigger pull. For both of them it was a single phrase loaded with a decade's worth of memories, unanswered questions, and grief they had each tried to bury. The intel was flawless, or at least that's what we believed. We were tracking a high-value target, a well-connected arms dealer whose network reached all the way back to a major political figure at home. The briefing gave us a precise window and a precise location, a narrow cave system in the foothills. The orders were simple and clinical: surgical extraction. Get in, secure the target, get out. No unnecessary engagements. Clean and contained. Her voice stayed low, her delivery measured, but under the even cadence was the faintest tremor, an almost imperceptible echo of pain that had lived inside her for 7 years. We inserted covertly, under full darkness, every step planned down to the smallest detail. The approach was smooth, no complications. We advanced exactly as trained, using the terrain, moving without a sound. Everything was textbook, too textbook, no sentries, no forward scouts, no resistance at all, the kind of perfection that doesn't happen in the real world. She exhaled slowly. We didn't see it for what it was until it was too late. Her eyes sharpened as she continued. We breached the cave entrance exactly as the plan called for. Inside there was nothing, no target, no arms dealer, not even the signs of an abandoned position. Just one empty chamber, bare stone and stale air. And then, without warning, our comms went dead. Completely dead. Not static, not interference, just silence. She paused there, drawing a long, steady breath, as if steadying herself before reopening the wound. That's when we knew. It wasn't bad intel. It wasn't a blown mission. It was a trap, an ambush laid with absolute precision. The moment our communications were cut, the hill itself seemed to come alive. Not with insurgents, not with foreign fighters, but with our own, or at least people equipped with our gear, operating on our intel, moving with our tactics. They weren't there to take prisoners, they weren't there to gather intelligence, they were there for one purpose only: complete elimination. They were there to erase us, to clean up a mess someone didn't want exposed. Her gaze hardened, the memory sharpening her tone into a bitter razor-like edge. We knew in those last few moments what had happened. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was sanctioned. Someone, somewhere high up, had made a deal. The arms dealer we were hunting was being protected. He had something on them, a connection to a backroom deal, a financial scandal, something that couldn't be allowed to get out. Our mission was never about a surgical extraction. Our mission was about a cover-up. We weren't a team of elite operators on a mission of national security. We were a sweep and clear crew. They sent us to die to protect a narrative, to protect a career, to protect a lie. The full weight of the betrayal settled in the air between them, a crushing, suffocating reality that eclipsed the physical space they stood in. Victor felt the blood run cold in his veins, the confirmation of a truth he had long suspected but had never dared to say out loud. He had believed in their mission, in their purpose, in the inherent rightness of what they did. Now, standing before the living proof of that mission's corruption, his entire belief system felt like it was teetering on a precipice. Dana continued, her words now a quiet, powerful indictment of the system that had created them. I fought my way out. I was the only one. I went into the hills, bled and hid for 3 days. When the rescue crew finally came, it wasn't to find me, it was to ensure there were no survivors. The report was written before they ever sent in the team. They had already declared us Kia. Black Ops mission went sideways, no survivors, no recoverable intelligence, no trace of Phantom Trace. She let the name hang in the air, a title that now felt like a brand of betrayal. I watched from a distance as they sifted through the wreckage, collecting our gear, making sure the story was watertight. That's when I realized. It wasn't about the mission anymore. It was about the people who gave the orders. It was about serving their agendas, their careers, their mistakes. And in that moment, I made a choice. I chose to disappear, not just from the valley, but from the entire system that had created me. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, a raw, emotional confession that was far more powerful than any shout. I'd rather be invisible than be a weapon for the wrong cause. I'd rather spend the rest of my life cleaning rifles and managing inventory than take one more shot for a mission that exists only to protect a lie. She turned her head slowly, eyes settling on the backstop where 5 impossibly precise bullet holes sat clustered so tightly they could be covered by a coin. They were small, almost delicate in appearance, yet they radiated an unshakable weight, the silent epicenter of everything that had just unfolded. They laughed, she said at last, her tone stripped of any trace of heat or pride, as if the words themselves were a plain statement of fact. Every single one of them laughed when I missed the paper, but what they failed to grasp was that I was never aiming for the paper at all. This wasn't about points on a scoreboard or proving myself in some staged competition. It was a message, a lesson, carried at the speed of sound, meant for anyone who builds their judgments on uniforms, on ranks, on job titles, for anyone convinced that the quiet, unremarkable figure in the room is automatically the least important person there. Her voice faded, but the meaning lingered, suspended in the still air of the empty range. The truth stood there, as stark and immovable as the concrete wall itself. She had not fired at a target so much as at the arrogance, the prejudice, the very structural assumptions of the military order. What had been mistaken for a public humiliation was, in reality, a flawless and deliberate display, an unmistakable proof of her capability, of the control and precision she still possessed. Those 5 rounds were more than a mark of skill. They were an indelible record of what she had endured, of the betrayal she had survived, and of the choice she had made to wield her mastery differently. Not to end lives, but to reshape minds. In that moment, she was no longer just a weapon honed for war. She had become something far more untouchable, a shadow, a legend, a mentor whose lessons spoke louder than any rank or command. And for those willing to look closely enough, the message carved into that wall would stand as a permanent warning. The story of Dana Voss and the impossible shot spread through the military training center, not through official channels or formal announcements, but in the clandestine currency of rumor and whispers. It was a tale that traveled in hushed tones over lukewarm coffee in the mess hall, during smoke breaks behind the barracks, and in the quiet of the dormitories after lights out. It was a story that changed slightly with each retelling, growing taller in the telling, but the core truth remained a chilling, unshakable constant. The quiet woman from logistics, the one they all laughed at, had demonstrated a level of skill that defied logic, and earned her the quiet, nervous respect usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. The mockery that had been Dana's constant companion for months evaporated entirely. The open derision was gone, replaced by a profound and heavy silence whenever she walked into a room. Private Mason Cole, who had so confidently bet that a bullet would end up in the parking lot, now watched her with a mixture of awe and genuine terror. His smug grin had been wiped clean forever, replaced by an expression of bone-deep unease. Corporal Trent Evers, who had mocked her for not knowing which end the bullets came out of, now meticulously inspected his rifle after every training session, as if expecting her silent, disapproving presence to appear over his shoulder. The combat trainees, who had seen themselves as the pinnacle of military prowess, now moved with a new sense of humility, their confidence shattered by the ghost of a woman they had so casually underestimated. The first official shift came from Range Safety Officer Arthur Graves, the veteran, a man who had seen too many things to dismiss the impossible, recognized a fundamental truth: a legend was walking among them, and to ignore her would be an act of profound strategic negligence. He began to assign Dana to what were officially listed as routine equipment inspections and maintenance. On paper, it was a perfectly normal task. In reality, it was a series of covert one-on-one sessions that were part marksmanship consultation and part ballistic analysis. He would bring her a rifle, asking her to check for what he called subtle wear and tear, but his questions were far from routine. "What kind of barrel harmonics would you expect from this wear pattern?" he would ask, his voice a low rumble. How would a minor inconsistency in the rifling here affect a shot at 500 meters, assuming a 3-knot crosswind? Dana in these moments would shed her quiet facade. Her eyes would take on a new intensity, and her voice, still quiet but now infused with a wealth of expert knowledge, would provide detailed, precise answers that went far beyond the standard curriculum. They were not just talking about equipment, they were discussing the intricate science of shooting at an elite, theoretical level, the kind of knowledge that could only come from a lifetime of experience and a frightening level of natural ability. Graves was not an instructor in these moments. He was a student, a veteran who was finally getting a glimpse into a world of mastery he had only ever heard whispered about in classified circles. The second ripple effect, far more subtle but just as profound, began to appear in the barracks. It was a phenomenon that was entirely anonymous and had no official trace. Under the doors of a select group of elite special operations candidates, small, meticulously folded notes began to appear. These were not generic training tips. They were detailed, highly specific analyses of shooting techniques, identifying common errors that were invisible to all but the most seasoned of eyes. The notes spoke of things like subtle breathing irregularities, imperceptible shifts in muscle tension, or minuscule inaccuracies in trigger pull, the tiny fractional movements that separate a good shooter from a true master. They offered corrections, new techniques and suggestions for improvement that were so precise, so revelatory, that the trainees who received them felt like they were getting a secret cheat code to the entire art of marksmanship. The notes were never signed, no one ever saw who placed them, but the effect was undeniable. The candidates who were receiving them began demonstrating remarkable, almost supernatural improvements in their shooting scores. Their groupings tightened, their tactical awareness sharpened. They learned to think not just about the shot, but about the science of the shot. They began to understand that mastery wasn't about strength or bravado, but about a deep, quiet understanding of the mechanics, the physics, and the mental fortitude required to be perfect. The notes were more than advice. They were a lesson delivered by a ghost, a mentor who existed only in the results she produced. Dana continued her double life with practiced ease. By day, she was the invisible logistics specialist, the background noise no one paid attention to. She still arrived on time, completed her tasks with quiet efficiency, and maintained her carefully constructed facade of unremarkability. But her influence, once invisible, was now a quiet but undeniable force in the lives of the trainees. She had, in her own way, found a new purpose. She was no longer a weapon, but a teacher. She wasn't taking shots for the wrong cause. She was shaping a new generation of warriors who, thanks to her silent tutelage, were learning to think beyond the simple act of pulling a trigger. The legend of Phantom Trace had been declared dead, but the ghost, it seemed, was still very much alive, and its influence was only just beginning to be felt. The change at the training center, once a whisper, was now a deep and pervasive current, a quiet revolution taking place in the unseen corners of the facility. The official training calendar continued unchanged, a monotonous schedule of formations, drills, and standard marksmanship evaluations. But for a select few, an entirely different curriculum was taking place, one that had no official records, no grades, and no witnesses. This new program was known simply as The Circle. It was an invitation-only group that met after regular hours in a converted supply bay, a cavernous space at the far edge of the compound, far from the prying eyes of drill instructors and the bright lights of the main barracks. The bay was a temple of a different kind, its air heavy with the industrial scents of hydraulic fluid, metal shavings, and ancient dust. The only light came from a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting long, stark shadows that danced on the stacks of crates and the rows of heavy equipment. The atmosphere was one of solemn camaraderie and shared purpose, a palpable sense of being part of something secret and profound. The entrance into the circle was marked by a moment of awe and existential challenge. The trainees, the same ones who had received the anonymous notes and had seen their scores miraculously improve, would be brought to the supply bay by Arthur Graves, who had become the silent gatekeeper to this new world. Graves, a man who had seen it all, would simply gesture to the far wall of the bay, a massive concrete structure that mirrored the backstop of the main firing range. There, in the dim yellow light, every single new initiate saw it. 5 perfectly aligned bullet holes, clustered so tightly they could be covered by a single coin, a permanent and terrifying monument to a skill that should not exist. The original bullet holes from the firing range had been a shock. These, deliberately recreated in a space meant for storage, were a symbol, a new kind of scripture. And then came the rule, the single unyielding condition for entry. It was whispered, but it was absolute. You could stay and be part of the circle. You could learn the secrets of true mastery, but only if you could, on command, replicate that grouping. You had to prove in a single session that you had the potential to achieve the same impossible precision, to thread the same impossible needle, to become something more than a mere marksman. The challenge was not just a test of physical skill, it was a psychological gauntlet. It was a demand for perfection, a mirror to their own limitations, a humbling realization that everything they had learned before was merely the foundation, not the peak. Dana Voss was the silent mentor of the circle. She never stood at the head of the group and gave a lecture. Her presence was a lesson. She would stand in the shadows, a faint spectre in the dim light, observing. She would watch a trainee struggle with a shot, their posture slightly off, their breathing uneven, their frustration mounting with every miss. She wouldn't speak. Instead, her hand would move, a quiet, almost imperceptible gesture, pointing to a subtle flaw, a minor adjustment that would change everything. The trainee would make the change, take the shot again, and a new, perfectly drilled hole would appear next to the others, a single definitive proof of her guidance. The trainees who were part of the circle emerged from their after-hours sessions, changed men and women. Their swagger was gone, their loud confidence replaced by a focused, quiet intensity. They were sharper, not just in their aim, but in their awareness. They learned to see the world differently, to notice the minute details that others missed, the subtle shifts in the wind, the tension in a person's posture, the truth that lay beneath the surface. They had learned the value of observation over action, of precision over brute force. Most importantly, they developed a profound and unshakable respect for the unseen. They understood now, in a way the other trainees never would, that the most dangerous person in the room was not the one with the loudest voice or the biggest gun. The most dangerous person was the one nobody paid attention to, the one in the corner, the one whose role seemed mundane and unimportant. The impossible shots on the back wall of the main range and the impossible grouping in the supply bay were not just a demonstration of skill. They were a lesson in humility, a permanent, silent reminder that mastery often wears the most unremarkable of disguises. The legend of Phantom Trace was officially dead, but the ghost was a teacher, and she was molding a new generation of warriors who, in their own quiet way, were learning to be ghosts themselves. The legend of Phantom Trace was officially dead. The final report had been filed, the documents sealed, and the name permanently erased from all active databases. But legends, as everyone at the Federal Military Training Center was about to learn, are remarkably difficult to kill. They simply adapt, they evolve, and they find new life in the most unexpected places. Dana Voss continued her double life with the practiced ease of a master. By day, she was the invisible logistics specialist, the background noise that no one paid attention to. She still arrived exactly on time, completed every assigned task with a methodical, quiet efficiency, and moved through the massive bureaucracy of the facility like a ghost. She maintained her carefully constructed invisibility with an almost artistic precision, and for the outside world she was nothing more than an uninspired clerk, a placeholder in a world of warriors. But her shadow, once a simple outline, was now a profound and powerful presence. Her ghost mentorship grew in strength and influence. Staff Sergeant Victor Hale, who had appeared and disappeared like a spectre, returned to the facility twice more over the following weeks, but he never approached Dana directly. Instead, he observed from a distance, a silent, watchful figure who took notes and made phone calls to numbers that didn't exist in any official directory. His reports, filed in databases that were classified at a level far above the pay grade of everyone present, contained variations of the same unsettling conclusion. Asset remains in place. Capabilities intact. Status monitoring but non-inference recommended. The system, in its own cold and calculating way, had decided to leave the ghost where it was, to observe her but not to engage with her. For Dana, this was a kind of victory. She was free, but not without being seen. She had a new purpose, a new mission that she had chosen for herself, and she pursued it with the same quiet dedication that had defined her old life. She was no longer a weapon to be pointed at a target. She was a teacher, a mentor, a force of change that worked in the shadows. The small invitation-only group in the converted supply bay continued to meet after hours, a secret society of excellence. The trainees who attended these sessions emerged sharper, quieter, and with a newfound respect for the unseen. They were learning not just how to shoot, but how to think, how to observe, and how to understand that true power often lies not in being seen, but in remaining in the shadows. This was her life now, a carefully balanced existence between the mundane and the extraordinary. She had chosen silence over recognition, invisibility over fame, and the quiet satisfaction of competence over the loud celebration of achievement. Her new mission was to pass on the lessons she had learned, the hard-won wisdom that had come from being betrayed, from being a ghost, and from being a legend. I never needed applause. I never needed anyone to know my name or to understand what I was capable of accomplishing. The truth about real mastery is that it doesn't require an audience. It doesn't demand validation. It doesn't need to prove itself to people who wouldn't understand the sacrifice required to achieve it in the first place. For 7 years, I chose silence over recognition. I chose invisibility over fame. I chose the quiet satisfaction of competence over the loud celebration of achievement. Because when you've held a rifle in situations where missing means innocent people die, when you've made shots that saved lives in ways that can never be officially acknowledged, when you've carried the weight of missions that exist only in the memories of the people who survived them, the approval of a few training facility recruits becomes remarkably unimportant. I didn't miss those targets. I hit exactly what I was aiming for. I wasn't shooting at paper. I was shooting at assumptions, at prejudices, at the dangerous complacency that comes from judging people by their appearance, their assigned roles, or their willingness to remain quiet in the face of mockery. Those 5 bullets weren't just a demonstration of marksmanship. They were a lesson, delivered at the speed of sound, a lesson to everyone who was too loud to hear it. The first lesson: never assume that silence equals incompetence. Some of the most capable people in the world have learned that advertising their skills is often counterproductive to actually using them effectively. They've learned that the less you talk about your abilities, the more they will surprise people. And in my line of work, surprise is the most powerful tactical advantage you can have. The second lesson: the most dangerous person in any room is usually the one no one is paying attention to. Threats that announce themselves give you time to prepare, to react, to defend. Threats that remain hidden until the moment of action leave you no time to respond, no time to even know you are in danger. That's a lesson that every warrior should have etched into their memory, a truth that could one day save their life. The third lesson: competence doesn't require external validation. True masters work for their own standards, not for the approval of others. They don't measure success by recognition. They measure it by impact, by the quiet, definitive knowledge that they did their job perfectly, regardless of who was watching. That's the only form of validation that matters when the stakes are life and death. The fourth lesson: underestimation is a gift. When people dismiss you, ignore you, or assume you're incapable, they are giving you the most powerful tactical advantage possible. They are giving you the element of surprise. I learned to use that gift not to kill, but to teach. I learned to turn their arrogance into a tool, a weapon to be used against their own complacency. The fifth and final lesson: sometimes the most important shot isn't the one that ends a life, but the one that leaves a mark in the mind. The greatest effect doesn't always come from taking down a target. It comes from changing how people think about targets entirely. I could have fired into the paper, perfect center mass, 5 rounds touching, a flawless example of textbook marksmanship. It would have been neat, impressive, and meaningless. It would have only confirmed what they already believed. Instead, I aimed for something more valuable. The moment they realized that mastery often wears the plainest disguise, that a person's worth can't be judged by their role, their uniform, or how loudly they announce their abilities. From now on, every time someone looks at a logistics specialist, a support worker, or anyone whose duties seem ordinary and unimportant, they'll remember those 5 perfect holes in a concrete wall. They'll remember that mastery doesn't always arrive with fanfare and ceremony. And they'll remember that the quietest person in the room might be silent for reasons you should take very, very seriously. Thank you for staying with us and riding along to the end of this incredible story. The journey of Dana Voss, the one they called Phantom Trace, is more than just a tale of impossible shots and hidden legends. It's a story that speaks to a deeper truth, one that every veteran, every rider, and every person who has ever felt underestimated knows in their bones. You see, on the road, just like on the firing range, you learn to look past the surface. You learn that the loudest engines aren't always on the fastest bikes, and the flashiest gear doesn't make the best rider. True mastery, the kind that Dana displayed, isn't about the spectacle. It's about the quiet confidence you earn from thousands of miles, from the countless hours spent in the garage, from the moments where the only validation you need is the perfect balance of the bike beneath you and the endless ribbon of asphalt ahead. It's about that silent, profound satisfaction of a perfectly executed turn, a smooth shift, a ride where you become one with the machine. That's the real victory, the one that doesn't need an audience or a trophy to be meaningful. Dana's lesson about underestimation is a powerful one. How many times have we seen someone on a beat-up old bike and we dismiss them? We assumed they were just some amateur, some tourist on a rusty old machine. But sometimes that old bike is their trusted companion, and the rider has a lifetime of experience. They're the ones who know every nuance of the road, every secret twist, every subtle shift in the wind. They don't need to prove anything to anyone. They're riding for themselves, for the love of the journey, and that's the greatest strength you can have. They've mastered the art of being invisible, of moving with a quiet purpose, and they found their freedom in the shadows. Her philosophy resonates deeply with the spirit of the veteran biker community. We're a family built on respect, not on rank or reputation. We know that the person next to you at the gas station, the one quietly cleaning the chrome on their Harley, might be a retired Green Beret or a master mechanic who can fix any problem with a single glance. We've learned that the most profound wisdom is often delivered not through grand speeches, but through a few simple, well-chosen words, a quiet nod of approval, or a subtle suggestion that changes everything. And that's what makes this story so powerful. It's a reminder that every person has a story, a history, a depth that you can't see. It's a call for us to stop judging, to stop assuming, and to start listening. It's a lesson to look a little closer, to ride a little quieter, and to find the mastery that often hides right in front of us, wearing the most unremarkable of disguises. This story, like all the ones we share here on Veteran Biker, is about more than just bikes and military life. It's about the universal lessons we learn along the way. The lessons of resilience, of honor, of brotherhood, and of finding your purpose long after the initial mission is over. We've been privileged to share this incredible journey with you, and we hope it's given you something to think about on your next ride. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about a time you were underestimated or a quiet mentor who changed your life, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below and let us know your story. We love hearing from every single one of you. Your support means the world to us and allows us to keep telling these stories. So, if you haven't already, please hit that like button to show us you enjoyed the video and subscribe to join the Veteran Biker family. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss another story from the road. As always, thank you for watching. It's time to ride on. Check out the videos appearing on your screen now to continue the journey.